Hello, everyone, and I join my welcome to everyone else's welcome to have many welcomes. It's great to see you here and to have you here in Geddes Hall, a space where we live, not literally, but over these last 2 weeks, literally. So, and we're here to speak tonight. Many of the things you hear this week hopefully will inspire you and fuel your own imaginations. Tonight is, in some sense, a darker world. They let the Irish Catholics start off with the darkness. And so I'm here to give a sense of where we stand culturally, sociologically, relative to sort of why the work that we do matters. And I want to give an image of the work we do as we start out the week, which is that of the Pelican. And the Pelican is more than the NBA franchise in New Orleans. The Pelican is an ancient Christian image of the Eucharist. The pelican in mythology would feed itself, or would sort of, the mother pelican would wound herself to feed her young. And this is the kind of image, actually, that had a lot of, it got taken up in a good deal in Christian life. So you find it in altars, on altars very, very prominently, but even on houses of Christian charity, of love. I was in Warsaw last summer, and there on the main hospital was this Eucharistic image of the pelican. In sort of the hospital. So it's this taking over of an image to tell a narrative about what we're about. And so I want to reclaim this image and say that in some sense the Eucharistic life is going to unite two things: the total love of God now made flesh, remembered but made flesh, and the union of God's people in the church. And that actually what's at risk is both the forgetfulness of this love and the fragmentation of God's people. Those are our 2 points of risks and why our work is necessary. But I wanted to start with a discussion and a chance for you all to introduce yourselves to each other and eventually to me. And so I wanted to start with this discussion. I don't want to exit full screen. I like it. Okay, thanks. So the following quote from Sacrosanctum Concilium I always find to be a bit absurd. Not because I don't believe it, but there's an absurdity to even that which you believe. Like when my wife said, "I love you too." There's an absurdity to that sort of return gift of love. So in this document, this Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy, we read as follows: "The liturgy through which the work of redemption takes place, especially in the divine sacrifice of the Eucharist, is supremely effective in enabling the faithful to express in their lives and to portray to others the mystery of Christ and the real nature of the true church. It's supremely effective in enabling the faithful to express in their lives and portray to others the mystery of Christ and the real nature of the true church." This often seems stunning to me when I think about what I do at my parish, which is a lot of the time schlepping a kid back and forth to the back where I know we should let the little children come to us, but sometimes the little children want to tear the candles down. And so we have to take them to just a mildly appropriate place, a cloister walk. This is in my life. You probably don't have a cloister walk, but I do. And I spend about 45 minutes at Mass sometimes with a newly walking toddler walking the cloister walk back and forth as she plays with the baptismal font or plays with glass or simply wants to scream in joy and run. And to learn to run. She learned to walk in the light of Christ, and now she's ready to run with the Lord, or at least run somewhere. The Eucharist is supremely effective in enabling the faithful to express in their lives and to portray to others the mystery of Christ and the real nature of the true church. That's our parishes, at least in principle. So think to yourselves, and so this is your task for the next 8 to 10 minutes. That's quite a claim. Why do you think it's so difficult for our parishes to enact this vision? Maybe your parishes do a great job. But I do find it somewhat challenging to convince people that actually in the Mass, people express in their lives and portray to others the mystery of Christ and the real nature of the true church. I mean, that's a stunning claim. Why do you think it's difficult? And where you don't think it's difficult, why do you think it works? So I'll let you be happy for a bit as well, sort of joyful. Look at the world through rose-colored glasses instead of my own. So for the next 8 to 10 minutes, I'd like you to talk to each other about this at your tables. And this group, we have a group here and a group, we can find friendship across the boundaries, can't we? So let's do this, and then I'll see you in about 8 to 10 minutes. Great, so I'd love to hear from folks. You don't have to represent your full group because that's a lot to put on anyone, but to sort of represent your own sort of thoughts. If you'd introduce yourself so we would get to know you, that would be great. Your name, where you're from, and what you do, at least professionally insofar as you're here. What you do, of course, is a much larger question. Yeah.
My name is Alicia Nagy, and I am from South Bend, and I work at Good Shepherd Montessori School in the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. But I am a mother of 8 children, so that's really the main thing. So I see this two very opposing sides. One is I totally recognize the cloister walk of like 20 years of doing that, and yet seeing how God has somehow managed to reach into our family, and I see fruits of faithfulness because I think that spiritually as children we have the absorbent mind where we go into the church and somehow, even if we're not like, consciously meditating and quietly, piously praying, we are part of the community and we are being fed. Like if you go outside and you get burned by the sun, regardless of what your activity you're doing. So that was one idea. But on the other hand, you see that there is a bit of a crisis of liturgy and the relationship of the Mass being transcendent, and the fragmentation comes from the characters of different priests coming through or different styles, kind of making us think that we can pick and choose, and then we start pointing and not realizing why we're really there. So these are two opposing views of what is happening when we go to the
The liturgy is viewed as a kind of, well, I wouldn't say political, but a thing that you choose, what you like, what you don't like, whereas you're speaking, on the other hand, of a kind of more saturation, of a kind of lifetime of saturation in something so that it sort of infuses you, devoid of whether you know it entirely or not.
Right, and it doesn't matter if we've been on vacation and we're in a parish that's completely different than ours. If we just are faithful to making the attempt, God still reaches in and somehow is transforming us by His grace, regardless of whether we feel it or not, or it was a great experience.
This is an excellent point. It's one we're going to take up because it's an attitude that's basically disappearing. Not in a bad sense, but the sense that you just show up and that is the effect. That there's a disappearance of this. We'll talk about it today. But it in fact is the necessary, in order to make sense of this claim, it is the necessary claim. Otherwise, we really need better pyrotechnics in order to ensure that it's amazing each time. And you can only go so many pyrotechnics after a while. I mean, so many magicians that can make like buses disappear. Maybe that was a part of my childhood and not yours. Others? I will. But in a bit. I'm whetting the appetite. It's like a tease. Yeah. Father Matthew.
I am Father Matthew. Thank you. I am an Episcopal priest in Central Illinois with 2 churches. And what I brought up in our discussion as far as what I face in my 2 relatively small parish churches is some people, a small minority are into this, but the vast majority are simply not coming to church at this point in any articulated way to experience or look for this kind of mystery of Christ. That's not how they would articulate how and why they come to church. I have a number of women who have been coming to my parish church for 85 years. And God love them, of course. It's a
Are you a Southerner? Because that's the beginning of a...
Which part?
God
love them, but then you.
That's
how my neighbors.
I'm a Yankee through and through, but I guess I picked a couple things up along the way.
Yeah, you did.
Anyway, but you know, I'm not trying to disparage that kind of Christianity. I'm simply saying they come, and they've said this to me. It's a habit to see their friends, and it's because what we grew up doing, going to church every Sunday. So when I, you know. So anyway, it's a matter of purpose. That's one thing, and then the other one is, at least in my experience, I introduced last year out of our class last year. Over this last year, I introduced this notion of that the Eucharist and us are very close. The Eucharist is offered on the altar, and the bread and the wine are offered on the altar, and they are our offerings, and God takes us as well, and then God gives us back to the community to be the Eucharist for the world. And some people understood that, and some people were like, what? You know, it's just, so there's a sense of, and what I summarized it as is, it's a bit abstract, it seems, to see themselves on the altar too. It's a concept they can get, like the words, but in terms of experience as and a feeling and a sense of actual participation, that's something that hasn't taken as of yet.
Absolutely.
So that's what the obstacles that I've noticed.
Thank you.
Others?
Yes.
I'm Deb Zenny, and I'm from Canada, from Toronto. Well, actually from Halton Hills, which is a small community outside of Toronto. There are pockets of people in the churches which I attend who live and are everything which is there. And then there are, as you said, the majority, which they're quite amazed when I preach and I propose this sort of thing in terms of pointing to the Eucharist during the homily, and they come up afterwards and say, Jill, that was just great, it was just wonderful. And I said, what? And they sort of look at me, and they don't know, they don't have words for it. They felt that they experienced it, but they can't put it in words. And that's part of the mystery of Christ. And when we explore it later, on the ground, like when the rubber hits the road sort of idea, they don't have a really close working relationship with Christ. They have a relationship in name.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And they go to church, and they know who Jesus Christ is. But they don't know who Jesus Christ is.
Others. Mary.
I have my rose-colored glasses on though.
No, I'm grateful for it.
Yes.
No,
It's more than acceptable.
So I'm Mary Marioni. I am from Phoenix, Arizona. Actually, if I get excited, I show that I'm actually from Brooklyn. That's where I grew up. And I am the national director for the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. And when I heard these, before that second paragraph came up, as I was reading those words, I got very excited because we're here at Notre Dame, and it made me think of Mark Searle. And because he said, do this in memory of me. Do what? Is it just to, and not just to, but to celebrate the Mass? Is it to be broken and shared? Is it to die and rise? Is it to love to this depth, totally and completely? I mean, I'm not quoting him exactly, but I hope it's the spirit of his words. And I think that if we look at that through that lens, we can see that our parishes may be enacting that vision in how we care for each other, how we love each other. Are we fully, actively, consciously celebrating Mass every time, all of us together at the same time? Probably not. But I just believe there's enough of that going on that it gets carried out into the community and into the...
Yeah, I think it's really important. Mary's point is a really good one to make, because I think it's important to think about two things. One, we really need to take seriously, and I hope we do this week, the humanity of those we work with. Often in church circles, unless one sort of speaks in sort of using ecclesiastical language officially, you think to yourself, like, well, these people don't really know what they're talking about. But of course, those of us who've endured birth and death and life and suffering and friendship and non-friendship know something about the mystery of love at the heart of existence. I mean, the logos that sort of created the world, the logos that oriented the world, made it so that sort of the meaning of creation at, sorry if I use philosophical language, at an ontological level, the level of being, is this gift, is this orientation towards love. And so we really need to take that seriously. Second, I think we also have to realize that after the Second Vatican Council, we're asking a good deal of human beings. The church has never been really full of people who all consciously did this. The church has actually mostly been filled with people who show up. And rather than sort of denigrate that idea, I do want to hold that up this week, this sort of saturation. People show up. And sometimes that's all I actually can do is show up. And sort of stop in and then say, okay, this was week. This was a week. This was Sunday. It was marked. And that sort of is sufficient. It's not sufficient, but because is it ever sufficient? But it's the beginning, and sometimes it's sort of the order. So yeah, I joked about that I think about the world darkly, and what I talk about tonight will have some degree of implication for the work we do. But I never want us to forget those two things. That actually our humanity is the site where salvation unfolds through Christ. And all that dimensions. And if we don't, I'm more scared that we're living a less human life right now than a less explicitly religious life. I think those things are linked, and we'll talk about that. But secondly, this is hard. It's hard, and there's a reason why monks mainly did it a long time ago. What one is trying to do in the world to live holiness concretely in the context of the world is not the most exceedingly easy thing to do. It is a gift, it's a treat to do it, but it is hard. One last statement perhaps by someone. We'll get another chance to talk in a bit.
Yes. My name is Pam. I'm from Los Angeles. I'm actually a high school religion teacher. I'm not quite sure how I got here, but
Well, welcome.
Yeah, I'm in liturgy as well. It occurs to me the absurdity of this statement is because we don't enact it. The Holy Spirit does it in spite of us.
Yeah.
So the problem is, what roadblocks in our parish do we have that slow down the work of the Holy Spirit? Kind of like you have to get out of the way of liturgy. That's why we have rules about the liturgy. Don't eliminate the gospel, as one priest decided to do.
Oops.
On Christmas Day, because he assumed everybody knew that gospel, so why bother proclaiming it? And he moved right to his following. What the hell? Yeah. There's a reason why there are rules.
Yeah.
So don't do that.
Don't do that.
If we learn nothing, if you had ever thought that was allowable, don't do it. Well done.
So I think that there's, it's I don't know how to fix. I don't know how to. It's a mystery how to move parish from a performer or deadly, or like I'm depressed now after this liturgy. Bad liturgy tears down faith. What's that quote?
Using in Catholic worship, yes ma'am,
Thank you.
and sing to the Lord.
Yes.
What's this actually?
The liturgy well celebrated can strengthen and grow faith. Liturgy poorly celebrated can weaken and even destroy faith.
Yeah, and I think we have to keep that in mind. So with Mary's very appropriate rose-colored approach, I think we have to remember that actually in a lot of places in the country that perhaps we don't come from, but there are a lot of places, or out of the country, there is a kind of dreadful blahness that has to be attended to. I'll give an example. I was, Mida, who's one of our speakers this week, I was visiting Mida, and I also met with the liturgy the liturgy formation crew, these are the official crew for the Diocese of Newcastle. And I said, oh, wow, things are, what are you guys doing? They're like, we're not doing anything. We really don't see anything positive happening. What are you doing? Well, we don't have money, we don't have energy, and people aren't going to church, so we really don't know what to do. And so here is this massive urban center in the northeast of England, functionally throwing the towel in, at least these two worship directors. And so as often as the rose-colored glasses are there, and there are places where this love, because we... Well, we don't need to talk about that. So, but we won't get into Episcopal politics. But how do we actually make systematic, strategic steps to offer something that is life-giving? And we have to think about that. Strategic, systematic, and we'll do that at the end. Well, I hope... Are we going to say something? Please, please, please. You raised your hand. It would be incorrect.
Ashley Fox, Director of Religious Education, Diocese of Venice, Florida.
I met your colleague last week.
Yes, he was here as well.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Great to meet you as well. Right here in front of everyone.
I just am, a catechist through and through, and I think of St. Augustine's Know is to Love. And I think there's a lot of lack of catechesis in our world today, and it needs to start with evangelization. So I'll just summarize it in that short clip.
Great. Yeah, no, we'll get there. It's something about a contemplative encounter with love, who is a person in our tradition, not an abstract thing.
Tim?
Yes.
Don't you think these documents all operate out of a vision? And I think there are many ways that we hide the vision of the church, the true nature of the church. That statement operates out of a vision that the liturgy has the potential for this. And we're lacking the articulation of that vision.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I would say it's even absurd on another level, which is it's absurd because it's saying that something that we do as human beings, of course, given from the church through the efforts of God, right? God is the primary actor. Actually, that's the stunning part. That through us, God can be the primary actor. So there's always going to be something absurd about it in a good way. I don't mean that in a bad way, but there's always something that should leave us wondering. And I mean that in a positive sense to it. But yes, I think it is a vision. But it's a vision that actually is rather stunning. Like the stunning claim that an infant is also God. There's a kind of insanity of that claim, because God is that which is most powerful, yet in Christ, God became weakest. And of course, an infant has strength of a sort, but not power, not prestige, not glory, not fame, not fortune, not bodily self-control. What an infant has is, well, what's that? Attraction, interaction. It certainly drew the whole world to see this little babe born in a hidden place. And in some sense, that's the absurdity of our claim, is that in these hidden spaces gathered throughout the world, even ones where it doesn't seem so, love comes. And of course, that's the vision, but it's also a reality. It is what is. And sometimes that's the hardest thing to see, the isness of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just came from another conference, though, where we talked about worship and cosmology, and the thing, the breadness of the bread and the wineness of the wine, and the materiality of the presence of God. So I'm not sure what you're saying is absurd. I'm not following the use of that term.
Sorry, yeah, that is absurd, that God has revealed God through materiality. That's the basic sort of paradox of the Feast of Christmas, that which is invisible has revealed itself through the visible. That which cannot be seen has become seen. This is, in some sense, the paradoxical claim of Christianity. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm still trying to figure out the use of absurdity.
Okay, absurd sometimes just means absurd. It doesn't always mean absurd in a negative sense. Absurd can be absurd in a positive sense. That which leads us to say, what is this? Okay, I don't want to get stuck on absurd. If absurd doesn't work, whatever you fill in, the wonder is fine and appropriate. I want to start, though, with a claim that I want to guide us through, which is, and I actually want us to listen to something. It's you know this well, so I won't introduce it, but it's that of a speech of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I want to do this to introduce forgetfulness and fragmentation. But I have to do something weird. There you go.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the hiking Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, Let freedom reign from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom reign from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom reign from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom reign, and when this happens, when we allow freedom reign, when we let it reign from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Different than political speeches today, which is an understatement. But I mean, think about what you need to know in some ways to get the speech. Not at the surface level. Of course, you get it. I mean, it's you could ask anyone what's this about, and they would know. But there's such subtlety in it. The actual degree of biblical reference, right, from the prophetic tradition, that on this mountaintop all shall gather, that this shall be the mountain of the Lord, where all the nations shall stream, right? The reference that you find in Isaiah, it's a reference you certainly find in Jeremiah. It's this sort of prophetic reference. It's also a reference to American sort of tradition, right? So American understandings of what freedom is and what the Declaration of Independence is. There's references to African-American spirituals and my country 'tis of thee, right? And this is used for a purpose, to bring people together because it's a common fund of memory, right? You can bring people together under a common fund. It's things that sound familiar and you can kind of say yes to. Or at least in principle you could say yes to. That there's a degree of unity that's by what we know. We experienced this somewhat recently in the United States with the royal wedding, at least to a partial. There's not many television events that draw lots of people to watch, but for some reason, Americans who, after having overthrown the king, are now very interested in the king and what they're wearing. So tea was a problem, but now we want to know what tea they're drinking. So we look over, and there's a sense in which we have a common sort of fund of information to talk about, but we actually, as a culture, don't have much of this fund today, and that's what I want to talk about. That the lack of this fund, the lack of this memory, leads to some problems with fragmentation, of bringing us together. And so I want to give you some ideas that will help you think through the rest of the week. This is not the defining presentation of the week. There are much others that will give you the kind of theological and pedagogical richness that I hope to at least show is possible. It always does this. It seriously does. It's like, and I never learn. Which is evidence of who I am as a person. There we go. So I want to talk a little bit about what secularization is and why we can speak about secularization as forgetfulness. One of the things that we get wrong with it's become a common trope in church documents or homilies that we live in a secular world. And what this doesn't mean is that we suddenly have lost consciousness of all religion. That's just not true. If you look around the world, there's actually more religious understanding today than there was perhaps in the 70s. In other words, religion exists. It's popping up here and there, and there's strength to it. It also doesn't mean that nobody has anything that is involved at all like a religious experience. At least for me these days, I'm watching the World Cup. And to those who are in the stadium, I root for England. I support England. And so I watched England versus Tunisia. And Tunisia was dressed. They were not at a soccer match. They were dressed for a sacrifice that never came. But there was a real kind of sense of ritual action of religiosity that was there. There was something transcendent that was happening in this moment. So you couldn't say like religion was gone or transcendence was gone. The French sociologist Daniel Hevue-Léger actually noticed this, that in France, the supposedly most secular of all countries, there was this uprising of religious fervor in the 80s, and that there were these little sort of outbreaks of religious groups. And she was wondering, what is the source of this? Why does a tradition die, and how does it get reborn in unique ways? And she makes an argument that religion functions, as she calls it, as a chain of memory. Think about a chain that has a link. And when you break off one of the links, the chain falls apart. It disconnects you from something. It connects something and then it doesn't. So she argues that religious memory functions as links in this chain, and when you get rid of this memory for whatever reason, and I'll make a suggestion why we have, then you lose this memory. So the problem of transmission, whether in culture or religion, is not primarily a problem of a failure to adjust to educational methods used to transmit a body of knowledge. It's not that you need a new method. It's, although you could. She's not a pedagogue, but she's making a different argument. It's structurally linked to the collapse of the framework of collective memory, which provided every individual with the possibility of a link between what comes before and his or her own actual experience. So I want to think for a moment of a place that hadn't entirely lost this chain of memory. It's a place that in Newton, Massachusetts, where I went to church when I was getting my doctorate degree at Boston College. It was an old Italian parish, Our Lady Help of Christians. And the chain of memory with the church was not just linked to who Jesus Christ was, although I really wish that the students would know that. They didn't. They didn't go to Mass, but they came to youth group. But that's a talk for another time. But their chain of memory was that the church was important and linked you to Nona and Nona before and Nona before, to the point where at one point in time you were linked to this little village in Italy where the festival of Our Lady of Mount Carmel was celebrated by taking the youngest girl in the parish that was of a proper age and hoisting her up above the belfry on her feast day, and she would throw glitter on a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary while fireworks were going off. You know, the kinds of things that they teach you as safe ways to treat children. So this is linked. And as much as I found this absurd because of what it was, it linked them to a chain of memory. They had a link to a tradition that they could tap into if they gave you a shot. They were there. And the problem with this, so we've heard a lot about how cultural Catholicism has died. And what happens is that chain gets broken. It gets broken because people move away, and there's no longer Our Lady of Mount Carmel, but there is the Apple Store, which functions as a kind of replacement. You don't know anything about the tradition that you've received, or you have a very thin sense of it, so you actually reject it without understanding what it is. This is my students, who inevitably are all on the way out of the church because of some primordial clash between religion and science, because Genesis 1 is bad science. And so I get to defeat that in about 15 to 20 minutes, and then they have to make a decision about if this is true, what would that mean for them. They don't know who Jesus is at all. Even my religious students, if you say to them something like, they would be happy to say, like, Jesus died for us. And I would say, okay, why? What is it? Why? Why did he die for us? That seems like costly. Like, what's at stake? Why that? There's no sense. There's a loss of the tradition, and there's a loss of the sort of cultural memory that goes along with it. I should say that this is one of the reasons that a lot of people see this clash between, like, traditionalists and Vatican II Catholics. I think one of the things that you can analyze traditionalists with, and I think we should, would be this desire for a memory. That they're not returning for these practices in the same way that another generation did, but they want a memory. So they don't eat meat on Friday, they wear the mantilla. This is it may not be some great polarization clash, but they want to attach to a memory. Religion in the West, and now more than in the West, as the West wins all things, too often, religion in the West is experiencing a crisis of memory. What is the tradition and what does it mean to remember? And when you're left with this, it's not that religion disappears, and so this is to return to my earlier point that I promised I'd get to. Oh, I'll get to this in a bit. No, I'll skip it. Is that the individual then is left alone to choose the religious tradition that is true. And religion becomes true simply to the individual because there is no memory to sort of measure yourself against. So think about big gatherings of Catholics, or actually, I don't even need a big gathering. I'll start with my experience of youth group as a kid. I grew up in the South, and so we had a kind of evangelical culture to our Catholicism. We were so evangelical that we even, when it came time to build our new church, we were the small church from that was born in 1950s East Tennessee, in this hidden away because the Catholics weren't supposed to be visible in 1950s East Tennessee, and we set up shop where only a good Southern evangelical Catholic would. Any ideas? No, where in the city? Where would you want to set up your Catholic church if you wanted to say we've arrived? A bar? Well, no. In a lot of places, I mean, a liquor store would be a good place because that's where everyone goes secretly in the South. But no one looks up, or you just look at each other's feet. Except the Catholics. You can always tell a Catholic in a liquor store in the South because they're like, hey, Bill, how are you? You set up across the street from Walmart. Because then we knew we had arrived because everyone would know Our Lady of Fatima, which is what we were called. We're Our Lady of Fatima, but my Southern friends, they didn't do it. They didn't do it jokingly. That's just what they're like. Well, who's this Fatima lady? And so I grew up in the South, and our youth group was very evangelical in a sense. So our major sort of moment of religious formation is a high school retreat in which we are blindfolded, which is always the first thing you want to do in a high school retreat is blindfold people. And you go into a room, and there's an image of Christ, and there's candles and music, and everyone's crying because you didn't expect this, partially because it's 10 o'clock at night and you were blindfolded and wandered. I mean, I didn't know what to expect, to be frank. And so we arrive, but to a T, every one of the people I belonged with there, they had a radical conversion to Christ that day. All of us. And there were about 60 or 70 people in my youth group, and today there are 3 of us that remain in the church in any sort of way. We didn't all leave for, some people had reasons that they left, grounded in, I'm sure, legitimate sort of claims of concern, but most people left, and frankly, I was actually healed of this because I was brought into a tradition. So I came to Notre Dame as an undergraduate seminarian. Not because I knew what seminary was or Holy Cross was or anything like that. I just sort of took a leap of faith. I was like, I think I want to be a priest. And I remember, the first week, they're like, here's the Liturgy of the Hours. And I was like, this is boring. Like, where's the praise and worship music? And then they're like, we're going on our first retreat. And I was like, yes, our first retreat. I can't wait for small groups and affirmation letters. And we heard it talk, and then they said, here's 3 hours of silence for you. It's like, this is you're not doing this right. And actually, over the course of a year, to speak of saturation, I was inculcated into a tradition, into a memory that was much larger than myself, that actually gave me the storehouse to begin to make sense of the crap of life that came on later. That once affection died away, I had a storehouse which to draw upon. And what was my storehouse? Well, in some ways, it was the Mass. It was the images of the Mass, but the center of the Mass was the totalizing love of God. There's an intellectual historian at Duke named Thomas Fow, and he writes in this book on what happens in modernity, what is forgotten, is that actually we stop thinking about knowledge as anything but facts and not as a tradition of wisdom. When allowed to operate within a hermeneutic, that's a fancy word. I always have to take a pause because I feel guilty ever using it. Because I was in graduate school for 2 years before I knew what the word hermeneutic meant. In graduate school, you're supposed to just shake your head, and even you're allowed to use it. You're allowed to say, that's a really interesting hermeneutical turn you made there. You have no clue what you mean. It just means interpretation. It's from the Greek god Hermes, who runs back and forth delivering message. So a hermeneutic is just an interpretation. So where you see and now the next time you're in a classroom and a professor uses that, you can hermeneuticize their hermeneutic. When allowed to operate within an interpretation, rather an informational model of knowledge, inherited conceptions and ideas furnish us less in the spirit of a definition than that of motivation and opportunity, with the intellectual and spiritual meanings that stand to be husbanded and cultivated further if we are ever to achieve any orientation in our own present. Is that one of our things is when this tradition disappears, we can't just then give pieces. Sometimes people use catechesis, not people involved in catechesis, the Good Shepherd, but I work with lots of people outside of CGS. So let me explain, you know this, but let me remind you what they say. They use catechize as a kind of violent word. We just have to catechize the people, which means we have to take information and give it to them. But of course, anyone knows how exceedingly difficult that is if you're in a variety of settings that is with, for example, older children, 18-year-olds. When I think about how do I catechize a group, I teach 150 students a course on marriage. How would I force information upon a group of 150 students, 15 of which are residents of Brotown, as I call it? They're in the back, hats backwards, pants down, and not all the way down, but shorts that are proximate to down. And they just sit there, and no matter much, I say, well, okay, so let's begin with the sacrament of the Eucharist. How many of you know the 7 sacraments? I mean, they don't give a damn. Formally. Informally, they also don't. The work that must be done, and this is why Catechesis of the Good Shepherd is so important to me, pedagogically to infuse other work, is it's not about an information. What the Mass is. Teaching the Mass, as we'll see this week, isn't a matter of giving better information about the Mass or more information about the Mass. It's a matter of giving information that matters. A worldview, of a vision, of a form of life that matters, of an intellectual and a spiritual meaning, a cultural worldview, should I say. That's got to be part of the goal to respond to this forgetfulness. It's a Eucharistic worldview. And I'll play this music before I say anything, for it ought to be played. This text, to me, is the kind of wisdom that is implicit in the Mass. More than implicit, it's what's sort of presented. Hail, true body, born of the Virgin Mary, truly suffered, sacrificed on the cross for humanity, from whose pierced side flowed blood and water. It is this flesh that the site of salvation, that the Eucharist for Catholics is not like an abstract salvation, like you're saved in this way abstractly. It's actually through the body of Christ, through the body that was born of the Virgin Mary, a body that entered into, the one thing about nativity sets is they often fail to show well what birth is like. A body that was born in that way, like came out with a weird-looking head, and whose mother suffered the results of that birth in a very tangible, real way, and also the gift of that birth, both. That site of salvation, that's the space of salvation for Catholics. That's the space where the Word comes flesh. It's in materiality. And it's this love of entrance into the materiality and into the total gift of love, into space and time, that is to be or become. Esto in Latin can be or it can be become. For us, a foretaste in the interrogation of death, in death's interrogation. I translate it that way because it actually draws more clearly what we as human beings deal with. That there's a drama at stake in what we do. I often think people who are religious, are Catholics, but too used to it, forget that there's a drama at stake. Because we kind of have forgotten that we're dying. That death is the end, and not like something else. We are going to die, right? Like that's the thing. We were born and we're going to die. And so the interrogation of death is the loss of all meaning, the loss of desolation, the loss of fear, the loss of friendship, the loss of communion. When you die, you're cut off in some ways. This is the experience of dying. This is why those in hospitals need us to visit them when they're ill, because they're cut off from communion in some real way. They need it more radically. This is the space of salvation. And so the memory we have to give isn't just, hey, look at these interesting practices that we once did. Or, hey, did you know what Catholics once believed? No, it has to be the kind of memory that this is actually linked to death's interrogation, to salvation, to be saved. This is our salvation. So what we do is not just pass on a memory. We don't want to just cultivate a memory as to be tradies who remember things from long ago because they're old. That's antiquarianism. We want to pass on a memory because it's in all the details of this memory that the fullness of this love is revealed, that this salvation is revealed. How does this relate to fragmentation, and then how does that lead us into what we have to do this week? I want to actually just begin with the chart. I was at a conference at Georgetown on polarization that studied the American Catholics' views of things as they exist in parishes. Democrats and Republicans. Amongst Republican Catholics, 47% believe immigrants strengthen our country because of their hard work and talents. 42% say that immigrants are a burden on our country because they take our jobs, housing, and healthcare. 86% of American Catholic Democrats do not think that. They think something radically different about immigrants, that they strengthen our country. And in the case of abortion, so to return to Jess's earliest point that we started with, it's opposite. Republicans are more likely to support or to worry about abortion than Democrats are. In other words, those in our parishes are more likely to identify with their political platform in the Democratic or Republican Party in the United States than they are to to identify with the particular teachings of the church on both these concerns. They're more likely to identify with their political platform. They're more likely to be polarized, to see things solely through a political lens. And I'll return to this point now. This is a problem because politics, the way that they function, polarized politics, is that it doesn't actually seek meaning, doesn't seek value, but just seeks one's position. Jacques Ellul, a reformed sociologist, and he was Catholic for a bit as well, and theologian, writes, "The political point of view allows people today to escape values, to obliterate the reality of human situations, which are individual situations and no longer of interest. What is true as real is hidden under politics. People carry posters and in a leisurely way discuss future plans and revolutions." He's writing in the 70s, so my students don't do anything in a leisurely way like that anymore, and they certainly don't discuss politics in a leisurely way. But political considerations permit us to think that we have the general solution because they permit us to do away at one stroke with all human reality in the search for truth. That because one has one's position, then you're no longer forced to abide in a community of people that seek the truth together, in love. That you can sort of sign up on your sort of wherever your pole is and live and abide there. This is a problem. And this is not the only problem that we have in our parishes. We also have the problem of open versus closed families. And I'll describe it like this. Closed families, in David Masco McCarthy, he describes closed families as following. The closed family understands its health and well-being in terms of emotional and financial independence. Homes are set apart in a neighborhood tied together by recreational interests and oriented to the outside world through contracted services, salary, wage earning, and consumption. So the closed family is the suburb. Think about many neighborhoods today. Where do people see each other and get to know each other? Who do they get to know? Well, if you're like my sister-in-law, for example, and I'm talking about her, but she won't see it. She won't watch this video. They live in a neighborhood in the suburbs of Chicago, a really nice neighborhood. They have no friends. Like, if something happens to their kids, my in-laws who live in South Bend have to drive into Chicago to care for the kids. They kind of know their neighbors, but their lawns are real big. In fact, dictated to be a certain size so that they don't have to encounter one another with too much regularity. The suburbs close us off and puts us so that actually the only human beings that tend to matter are the nuclear family, the ones inside our home. That's it. And so the rest of human beings are out there, but what really matters is my home. Compare this to the open house, so open household, not an open house, that's how you sell a home, but an open household, an open family. I moved recently to Granger, Indiana, which is a suburb in South Bend. I did it for schools, and I thought to myself, I am selling out. This is the final moment of selling out for me. So it was, and Joni was my neighbor, so I had to leave Joni. So we moved to Granger, but we moved in this cul-de-sac where basically 8 young families had just moved in. So every evening on our cul-de-sac, everyone gathers with a drink, with the kids who all run around and I think mostly care for each other. We haven't lost one yet. And we started to actually share a life together in some strange way. So when I travel, the moms will ask my wife, like, hey, you need anything for the grocery store? Going out for a bit, more than happy to sort of get you something. We're starting to watch each other's children. We're starting to just go into each other's backyards, right? That sacrosanct place in American life that no one enters because I have a gun. I don't, but I'm saying this sort of vision, we're starting to share and actually people are jumping over fences to see each other. This is what is presumed. If our churches, if our parishes don't have this, then do you really think that we can think about each other as brothers and sisters in Christ? If we don't reside in this open space of friendship, of solidarity, of love of those who are not my own, right? Because the family is the love that is your own. And the thing about an open family is it says, the love that I have is for my own so that others may also be loved. It's open. It has an openness to it. If we don't have that, our parishes will not flourish in love. And yet that's what we're called for. That the Eucharist is, of course, an entrance into this love, into this totalizing love of God made flesh, but made flesh in concrete and fleshed human beings too. And we'll hear this passage this week, so I'll only highlight Paul, a couple things in Paul. But Paul is talking to the church in Corinth. The rich are getting together early, getting wasted, and then celebrating the Eucharist. You know, so like a New York Eucharist. So that was really offensive, but I once went to Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and I won't describe for what reason, but it sounded a lot like the Corinthians. That the rich are getting together for a special sort of feast, and then only then sharing what's left over with the poor, but it's kind of treating it as drunkenness. Paul has a problem with this. And he says, for just as the body is one, and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one Spirit. We have destroyed this image. Not so much, partially because we've taken it as a kind of, no offense to stewardship. I'm a big fan of stewardship. But you take it as this kind of idea that everyone in the church has their role, and so it's a metaphorical body. Like, I'm good at the violin, and you're good at the drums, and I took tax code so I can help with the parish, and so we're all part of this. But that's not what Paul was saying necessarily. That's a consequence of what Paul was saying, but that's not what Paul was saying. But God has so composed the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior part, that there may be no discord in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. It's not a metaphor. It's not a metaphor. In the Eucharist, my neighbor is me. This is Paul's sort of insight. That suffering person is me. That solidarity is love because that person is me. And I'm him or I am her. It's a shared life. So this suffering isn't metaphor. This body of Christ imagery isn't metaphorical, but it's the very image that makes sense at the Eucharist. If, in that famous sermon of Augustine, we are to become what we are to receive, some people say, like, well, that means we're the body of Christ. And that's true. But then their next thing is like, so we're really important too, like the Eucharist. Yes, but you're made that way. Your importance comes not for you, but for others, for love. The gift that we've been given has been given for love. Total love has been given so that total love can be offered. And that, to me, is one of our... The way to solve this problem isn't a matter then of technique. I mean, it was raised like, I don't know how I would change a parish so that it would do this. Sometimes we think too much about technique. We consider everything a technological problem, and we lock ourselves into an environment that has become a system. So we think about new methods, new ways of doing everything, and we're constantly thinking about novelty. I mean, pastoral presses, this is how they make their money. Sorry, I'm about to insult pastoral presses. Catechist of the Good Shepherd is not one of these, but pastoral presses like say, this is the brand new way to run your parish, it will transform everything, and then when it doesn't transform everything in 15 years, there's a newer way to transform your parish, and it will transform everything. Technology isn't enough. It's actually dwelling with the old, dwelling with the basic. Something that I think Sophia Cavalletti recognized. With the material, with the basic. The essential. That's what yes, the essential. And this is in some ways what happens with the last way we're going to approach this week is through an aesthetic lens. When I was in Ghent, that makes it sound like I go to Ghent all the time. I was at a conference in Belgium and went to Ghent because I wanted to see the altarpiece, the Mystic Supper of the Lamb. And I had just gotten word that my grandmother had had a stroke. And this would be the stroke, this would be the beginning of the last group of strokes that would end her life. She had Alzheimer's for 12 years. And this was it. And everyone else in the conference was going to like some sort of gathering at a monastery to talk to one another. And I did not want to be with other human beings on a bus. While they're all like, so, where are you from? And I would say, my grandmother's dying. So that's just not the way to begin discourse. And so I went by myself to Ghent, and I went to this great altarpiece that had just been restored and put in this chapel. And it was around 12:45 when I arrived in Ghent at the Cathedral of St. Bavos. And it was one of the few churches in Belgium that actually was alive. You could tell there were candles and people praying. It wasn't a museum, it was alive. And except for the chapel where this altarpiece, Van Eyck's altarpiece, was on display. But it was closed. Closed. And altarpiece is, of course, open. So this view wasn't available. It was closed. And everyone's standing around. It's just pictures of people. And you can tell everyone's like, what is the big deal with this? Except they're speaking a variety of languages. And at 12:58, two curators, or sacristans, I'm not really sure who they were, because they felt more like sacristans in the end, came out. And they did something very simple. And they opened. And though the chapel said, be silent, everyone was talking until the people came out and did this. And then total silence came forth as what was revealed was the mystic supper of the Lamb. Dietrich von Hildebrand notes, when we say that beauty, or rather those things that are the barriers of beauty, are objective goods for the person, we mean that these belong to the category of objective goods for the person, in which things of intrinsic importance or value superabundantly overflow into objective goods for us. Each person there objectively saw the good, the mystery of love that was in some sense made manifest through this image. I'm sure not all would have said it like this. Not everybody was like me. I mean, this was a very powerful moment for me because as I thought about my grandmother's death, here was a vision of the heavenly host gathering before the Eucharist and thinking to myself, what a divine consolation this is in the midst of suffering. But everybody had something, some objective good, divine love that was revealed in this moment. In some sense, this is the approach in order to reopen the possibility for a tradition grounded in memory and one that can unite us. We need beauty. And of course, this week we'll see moments where beauty seems fragmented themselves, and we'll have sort of arguments about that. But we need some objective good, something beautiful to gather us around, to link us to this memory of love, and also to gather us together. And the Eucharist is this pedagogy. It operates out of this sort of pedagogy of beauty, which doesn't mean that it's just old or ancient or it uses lots of incense. What I mean, it's a bigger beauty than that. It's the beauty of love. So, this week, I invite you to think about a Eucharistic life. And I want to finish with one quote from Julian Caron from Communion and Liberation, which I find very funny. It's in a recent book he wrote called Disarming Beauty. In our lives, Julian Caron writes, we've been given the gift of the most beautiful toy, that is life, all the cosmos, but we did not come into this world with the user's manual under our arms. We don't know how to live this life well naturally. If I left my son to choose the natural life that he most would want to live, he would not make it very long. Early, he would just not eat, but even now, we would end up eating so many chicken nuggets. The world would just be overflowing with chicken nuggets. We need to ask ourselves the meaning of what we see and what has been given to us. We ask ourselves how to live, how to learn to enjoy what we have, how to learn to face reality in an adequate way so that life can truly be life, intensely lived and fascinating to live. It's the Eucharist that can provide this way of living an intensely beautiful, an intensely gifted, an intensely loving life. And I'll close with a story and then just an exercise for you as we end. As I want to conclude with one such image of the Eucharistic life, just to get us started. I want to conclude with an image of my grandparents' funeral. My grandmother's funeral. They didn't die at the same time. That would have been truly tragic. My grandmother and my grandfather had contributed as much money as they had to our new parish in East Tennessee. This would have been their home. So when we built it, it was really important to them. And they, not my parents, took me to Mass all those years. My parents are not active in the church, but my grandparents are. So they would drag us along to Mass. And my grandmother, when I was in second grade, insisted that I receive First Communion even though I had not been in any religious education class before. That she would take over and make sure that I knew the prayers. And I did. Hail Mary, I knew the Rosary, I knew everything. I knew everything very well, and Grandma made sure. And she was overjoyed when I received my First Communion. She was the one who wanted the full white suit. I was wearing a full white suit. I still wish I had a full white suit. You don't recognize what you have until you don't have it. And in some sense, the fullness of our family life, which was a rather sort of complicated one, was lived in Sunday Mass, regular attendance at the Eucharist. And my grandmother, as she died, received the Eucharist for the first time in years, as best as she could. She had not been going to Mass. I suspect it was too difficult for her to go and to explain that she couldn't remember who people were. And they were too prideful to receive the Eucharist in their homes. And so at the end, they finally let the priest in, and he gives both my grandfather and my grandmother, as best as she can receive, she can barely swallow, Christ's body and blood one last time. And soon after, my grandmother passed while my grandfather was holding her hand, and said to her, the kind of beautiful thing you want your spouse to say when you die, said, I will make sure that the world doesn't forget you. And then it's time to go to Tennessee for the funeral, and I'm the only Catholic left in the family, so that means I'm in charge. And so I planned this funeral with this priest who has no idea who I am at all, and I think presumes that I know nothing. Was surprised that I did know some things. And the day of the funeral arrives, and my grandparents had mostly been forgotten in the society. Not entirely, but they had been shut off from communion for so long that there weren't a lot of people from the parish that remembered them. There was Barb Steverson, who showed up. There was my grandmother's pharmacist from Kroger, who showed up, who couldn't believe she had passed. There were these random strangers who showed up functionally, and then the ragtag assemblance of O'Malley's, or O'Malley, Thompson, Capps family, who only several of us were involved in the church. And this included my son and my daughter, so the four of us are active Catholics, the only active Catholics who were there. And, we do the readings. And at the end, as the sort of nuptial song, at the end after communion, my grandmother had a wish for a couple of songs. She wanted Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, which we denied because we really felt that very white cantor was not going to do a nice job with Swing Low, Sweet Chariot on the very bad piano. So I switched that one out. But she wanted Schubert's Ave Maria because that was what was sung at her wedding. And as we received the Eucharist one last time, in some sense, in direct proximity to her, we received it. We hear this song that recalls their love, the life of Eucharistic love that they had lived. And then we process out, and we walk to the very site on the columbarium. My grandmother was cremated and is put on site there at the church. So ironically, every time I go to Mass, I get to visit my grandmother. This is the fullness of the Eucharistic life, from birth to death. And it's this Eucharist that can serve as that, if we let it, if we form people, not catechize them in a violent way, but form them to love this, to steeped in these images, steeped in this sensibility, then truly our lives become these Eucharistic offerings. That's my goal for you this week. Not that you get there this week, that would be a lot. But that we think objectively about how we create spaces in our parishes and our schools where this can be carried out. And so my question for you before we close the night, and I'm just going to give you about 5 minutes to sort of write for yourself on this. This week your learning here will be your own. It's always your own. You're adults, so. Name 3 objectives related to how you hope to discover the Eucharistic life of the Church this week as a way of healing forgetfulness and fragmentation. And be particular to your own context. This is the 3 things that will guide you this week. Whatever they are, choose those 3 things and let those be the measure of a successful week for you as you enter in.